Would please take your Bibles and turn to Psalm 40. I'll tell you what, I was reading this psalm about a month ago, and it just really spoke to my heart. You know how it is. You read something, and you've read something, and you've read something, and then all of a sudden you read it one time, and it's like, I never read that. And of course you have. But it's like God takes that passage and He just encourages you. He kind of smacks you a little bit to kind of wake up. And that's what happened as I was reading Psalm 40. I was just so excited about this psalm, and I tried to start memorizing some of it. I kind of have the first 4 verses down. But I thought, I wonder if I ever preached on Psalm 40. It seemed like one that I would have preached on before, and I had never preached on it. So I thought, okay, I'm going to start working on Psalm 40. I'm going to make a message. And one message turned into 2. 2 messages turned into 3. 3 messages turned into 4. And I ended up with 5. So I'm not going to preach all 5 tonight, so just relax. And so tonight we're going to just get started with Psalm 40 because really, he starts off with probably the most well-known part of this psalm. Notice what it says in verse 1. I waited patiently for the Lord. For you and for me, it's difficult for us to wait, isn't it? I don't like waiting down there at the train crossing. I go to Sharon's home down in Harriman, Tennessee, and they have the sense they at least they have a bridge or they have a place where you go under the railroad tracks. Not in Charlotte. It's like, okay, here's the train again. I have to wait for it. And life is filled with waiting, especially as I mentioned this morning, as we travel to see our kids or make a missionary trip. It's a lot of waiting. Life is filled with waiting. A mother expecting a child waits 9 months. A mother and a father waiting for that child to grow up may still be waiting. In life, we do a lot of waiting. But I think one of the most difficult things to wait upon, I should say person to wait upon, is God. Sometimes you and I look at a situation and we say, why isn't God doing anything? And I look at a lot of situations like that. I mean, there's people I have prayed for years, and it looks like, what is God doing here? I've been praying for certain people every day for a year or two, and praying that God would bring them to Himself, or God would help them to repent. And it's like, where is God? We all experience that. I know I'm not the only person. And so this psalm is just like, it's just for you and me. It really is. It's for people who need to learn to wait upon God. Now, the word wait to us so often is like us waiting for our hamburgers at McDonald's. The word wait has the idea of waiting, for the traffic light. That's not the word here for waiting. Waiting has the idea of looking expectantly upon God. It's not a passive word. As a matter of fact, we use the word wait. What do we have at restaurants? Of course, they're called servers now, but what did they used to be called? Waitresses or waiters. Now, why were they called that? Were they just sitting waiting for you to take your order? Why were they called waitresses and waiters, not servers today? Pardon? Waiting on you to what? Make your order? To serve. Okay, there you go. And so we give attention. The waiter and the waitress are to give attention to the person they're serving, aren't they? And if a waiter or waitress does really well, we really appreciate their attentiveness. When they see the water's half empty and they say, can I fill your water? And when they see this is happening, oh, can I help you with this? We say, wow, they're really good, and we leave a big tip. And then there's other servers or waiters, or waitresses. They come up and slap the food down, and then they slap the bill down. There's no smile, and we think, wow. You see, waiting on God doesn't simply mean passing time. Waiting upon God means attending to Him, listening to Him, desiring to serve Him, having hope in Him. And so here we see the psalmist say, I waited patiently for the Lord. God says He does things in His time. Remember, we sing that song, In His Time. I won't sing anymore. But you know the song, In His Time. That is a fantastic song because it reminds us that God does things in His time and not our time. And so the psalmist here says, I am waiting upon God, waiting for God to move, waiting for God to direct, waiting for God to act, but I'm going to do it patiently. Notice that adverb, patiently. In other words, David knows that God doesn't run on his timetable. God runs on His own timetable. Unfortunately, you and I have our timetable. You have your time when you expect God to do this. You have your time when you expect God to do that. And God says, hey, wait a minute. I have my own schedule. Remember Abraham? Abraham had his time schedule. He looked at his wife, Sarah, and she definitely didn't look like she was going to be able to have a baby. And Sarah looked at Abraham, and she said, well, maybe, but I don't see how this is going to work. And so she tells Abraham, what? Have a baby through my handmaiden, Hagar. You see, he didn't wait patiently on God. He had his time, not God's time. Moses. Remember, God had raised up Moses to be the deliverer of Egypt. But Moses had his time. He killed the Egyptian. It was not God's time. Have you done something foolishly? Have I done something foolishly? Or I should say all of us. Haven't we done something foolishly because we did it in our time and in our way instead of waiting patiently on God? We're not to walk behind God, I understand that. But we're not to walk ahead of God. You see, we are to walk with God. It's His time, not our time. So the psalmist here says, I waited patiently upon whom? For the Lord. Now, let me ask a question since we're all family here tonight. What makes it difficult for you and I to wait patiently on the Lord? Why is it so difficult? Hurry up, get your answers out. I only heard one. Come on now. We're impatient people. Okay. Exactly. Okay. Okay, we just get distracted. We forget about God and the circumstances. What else? We get discouraged. We think, hey, I've been waiting and nothing's happening. So that's what we do with people too, don't we? We throw people in the garbage bin because they don't respond as quickly as we would like them to. God doesn't ever tell us to throw people in the garbage bin. Or the garbage can, I'm sorry. The garbage can. And so He tells us not to do that. Okay, what else keeps us from waiting upon God patiently? Lack of trust, okay. Maybe other people can destroy our faith in God so we don't wait upon Him. And so David here says, I waited patiently for the Lord. And yes, it was difficult for him. Yes, his circumstances are terrible, because look at what his circumstances are in verse 2. He brought me up also out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay. I mean, look at where he is. He is in a pit. He is in quicksand. And obviously, if you're in quicksand, you want to get out as quick as possible. And God says, wait a minute, I'll get you out in my time. God, I'm sinking. I can't make it. Hurry. I'll get you out in my time. You see, it wasn't easy for David. He was in a pit. He was in the quicksand. And yet he said, I waited patiently upon God. Now he did something while he was waiting. What does he do in verse 1 while he's waiting on God? What's he doing? Help me. He cries, he prays, he cries out to God. Help! Help! If we're waiting, we might as well do something constructive. And you know, the most constructive thing we can do is pray. But notice his praying wasn't just, you know, how some of us pray. Oh, our dear, awesome Father, who art in heaven, we would love to see you act today. Oh, our heavenly Father. You know, all of a sudden we're falling asleep. No, he doesn't say that. He says, I cried out to God. You know, when a baby has a need, they what? They cry out. Change me, feed me, feed me. Now, I know they don't literally say that. I'm not that dumb. But I know they say cry out. They cry out to the parents, wake up. I have a need. And so here is David waiting upon God, waiting patiently on God. Yes, he was tempted to jump ahead of God. But he says, I'm going to wait patiently on God. Yes, I'm in this pit. Yes, I'm sinking. But while I'm waiting, I'm not going to be just passive. I'm going to cry out to God. Please don't quit crying out to God. I know it's tough sometimes. I know that it seems like God isn't answering. I've experienced that. But he's there. He hears you. Remember when Lazarus was seriously sick? And of course, Mary and Martha sends a servant to Jesus and says, Jesus, your servant Lazarus, whom you loved, is seriously sick. You and I would think, well, he would immediately drop everything and go to Lazarus. Or he had healed people from a distance. He had already healed people, I forget which one of the Jairus' daughter or the nobleman's son, one of them, he just said, he's healed. And when he was going back home, he was healed. So he could have just said, okay, he's fine now. I healed him. Nope. He stays there 2 days. And in the meantime, while he's just waiting around before he goes to Lazarus' house, what happens? He dies. And if you remember, Martha and Mary said, if you had only been here. Their timing was not God's timing. Because then he did that great miracle. Lazarus, arise. See, God knows what he's doing. But we need to know what we're doing. We need to wait in confidence. We need to wait patiently. And we need to wait in prayer. Ask. That means keep asking. It doesn't mean ask one time. Ask, and it shall be given unto you. Seek. That means keep seeking. Continually seek, and ye shall find. Knock. Now, very rarely do I ever knock on a door like this. How many of you do that? No, you go like this. Now, if you're sharing, you do this. But we never knock once. And that's what he's saying. Keep knocking. Keep knocking. Don't quit. And so the psalmist here is saying, I have cried out to God. But let's look at this answer. This is so exciting, the rest of this part of the passage. So he is waiting on God. He is crying out to God. And notice what he says about the response. I waited patiently for the Lord. And notice, what does God do? He inclined unto me. That's beautiful. Just stop and think about it. He inclined unto me. Now, I was reading a book about communication the other day. How to win friends and communicate with people or something. Something like that. Anyway, it was one of those for sale books at Barnes & Noble, and I thought, okay, I'll get it. And I haven't finished reading it yet, so excuse me if I'm not doing all the communication techniques that he said. But he said that he talked about the beginning of the book, nonverbal communication, okay? That's not what you say, it's your actions. And he says, to help you in your communication, remember the word soften. And each of those letters have a meaning. The S means smile. You always gain a lot more with a smile. A smile goes a mile, but a frown goes nowhere. Secondly, he says soften. O is open arms. That's not open arms. Okay, F is a forward lean. That's what God's doing here. That's showing a sincere interest instead of just, you know how people are. You ever see this, when people are talking to you, and I do this too, I know, I've learned. See, I don't do that. You know, how you lean back. Okay, yeah, just bring it to me. That's not what God does. When we cry out to Him, He inclines to us. He kind of leans forward. He's interested in your life. That's what David's saying here. He inclined unto me. He had a forward lean. You know, when you care about somebody, you lean towards them a little bit to like, I care about what you are, what's going on. I want to hear what you're saying. God cares that much for you. Now, just by way of interest, the T, I always forget the T. Nope. Touch. The T is touch. You know, just like a nice little touch, like a handshake, something like that to show an interest. And then the E is eye contact. And the N is nodding. Not nodding off to sleep, by the way, but it's nodding. But anyway, that's really important. I never really thought about that because, the forward lean. And that's what he says here. That's what God does. He inclines to us. He's interested in your life. He cares about your life. Now, maybe there's a whole lot of people that could care less about your life. I know that. None of us are famous. None of us are, unless you're hiding it, are terribly rich. But you know what? You are important to God. He inclines to us. When you cry, He doesn't turn His back. When you cry out to Him, He doesn't lean back and say, well, tell me more. He doesn't do this and say, I'm tired of hearing. I'm sick and tired of hearing. Just shut up. Aren't you glad that God doesn't do that? He inclines. He says, oh, tell me about it. I really care. And not only does He show interest, not only does He incline unto me, but notice what else it says in verse 1. And He heard my cry. In other words, God's interested in our lives. He inclines to us. But not only that, He hears us. He's listening. He hears. He doesn't turn us off. He doesn't consider your words background noise. He doesn't consider your words an annoyance. He's really very interested. Like today, for example. Today, we got a phone call, and it was from Anna. So obviously, we just sat there and said, just leave it. It's only Anna. No! We got up, we answered it, and we talked to her. However, when we hear the phone ring, and it's an unfamiliar number, from an unfamiliar zip code, What do we say? Let it ring. I don't want to answer. Aren't you glad that God doesn't treat us that way? You know why? Why were we so excited to hear from Anna? She's our daughter. And then David called. Well, same thing. We just said, oh, it's only David. Forget it. I have better things to do. No, he's our son. We answered the phone. We were excited to hear his voice and hear what's going on in Portugal. He's our son. See, that's how God treats you. He hears you. You're his child. And so when you are in that pit, when you are in that quicksand, God may not answer in the way that you want him to. He may not answer in the time that you want him to. But he does answer. He inclines to us. He is very interested in your life. You may think you're a nobody, but to God you are very important. He sent his son to die on the cross for your sin. You're that important to him. He's interested in you. He hears you. He hears your voice. This poor man cried, and the Lord heard him. He hears all of our prayers. But notice what else happens here. This is so beautiful. He's interested in us. He hears us. But then notice what he does in verse 2. He brought me up also out of a horrible pit, out of the miry clay. You know, if you're in a pit, a deep pit, you can't get out on your own. If you are in quicksand, you cannot get out on your own. And so the psalmist realized, I can't get out of this. Now the pit can represent a whole lot of things. The horrible pit can represent sin. You're so deep into sin, you just can't get out of it. It could be self-pity. It could be circumstances or bad habits or a defeat. A pit is a terrible place to be. Just ask Jonah. He was in a pit, right in the pit of the stomach of the great fish. He wasn't going to get out on his own. That's why he cried out to God. You see, you may have fallen into a pit, and it seems like there's no deliverance. But David said, yes, he brought me up out of that pit. He picked me up. He brought me up not only out of the pit, but the miry clay. You know, when you think of the miry clay, that's something that, what are you going to do? Anytime you want to try to move, you slip. There's no firmness in it. It is like trying to run on ice. The miry clay is slippery. There's no foundation. You can't get moving. You can't get going. Those are the preoccupations of this life. They're the things that keep us from moving forward with God. They are activities that may not be sinful in themselves, but they become more important to us than God. And he says, wow, God brought me up out of that pit. He brought me up out of that miry clay. I mean, it says in Psalm 69 too this, I sink in deep mire where there is no standing. I am come into deep waters where the floods overflow me. And then later on he says, deliver me out of the mire. Let me not sink. Let me be delivered from them that hate me and out of the deep waters. Only God can deliver us. Yeah, he may not do it in your time or my time, but he will do it. He wants to get you out of the pit. He wants to get you out of that miry clay. You don't have to stay in the quicksand. You may say, Pastor, I've made a mess. That's all right. You can't clean up your mess. Only God can. You can say, Pastor, I just don't seem to ever get moving forward. It just seems like every time I take one step forward, I fall back two. God says, look, you're in a slippery, miry clay. Let me take you out of there. He brought me up out of the miry clay. He brought me up out of the pit, the horrible pit. But he just didn't pick us up and take us out of something bad. He just didn't take us up out of the pit and the miry clay. Notice what the psalmist says here. And set my feet upon a rock. On Christ the solid rock I stand. All other ground is stinking sand. In other words, I know I didn't sing it right. I know it's sinking, but it's stinking too. The world is stinking in the nostrils of God. Notice, he doesn't just get you out of the pit. He doesn't just get you out of the quicksand. But then he says, look, I'm going to put you right back on Jesus Christ. He's the rock. He's the stone. He's the foundation. Now, instead of being in that pit, no hope of getting out, instead of being in that slimy clay, which is like quicksand, now you are on the rock. And that's what David said. He said, I waited patiently and God answered. He didn't answer in my time, but he did answer. And he brought me up out of that horrible pit. He brought me up out of the miry clay, and he set me plunk right on the solid rock. That's where we need to be. Where are you tonight? Where are you? Where am I? Are we in a horrible pit of our own making? Are we living a life where the pit just seems to keep getting deeper and deeper? Darker and darker? Lonelier and lonelier? Are we in that miry clay where it just seems like we just can't get a hold of things? We just keep slipping up. We just keep slipping and sliding. God says, look, I'm here. I'm here to bring you up out of that clay. I'm here to pick you up out of that pit, no matter how dark or deep it is. My hand can go as deep as you are, and I can lift you out. And I'll set you on the rock. I'll set you right on the rock. That's where you want to be. Don't stay in the pit. Don't stay in the miry clay. But he says, he put me on the rock. And as a result of that, notice in verse 3, and he hath put a new song in my mouth, even praise unto our God. Many shall see it and fear and shall trust in the Lord. In other words, now he has given me a song. He started with a cry in verse 1. But in verse 3, he has a song. And that song is a testimony to people all around him that they too will trust in God when they face the pit. See, your pit experience is not just for you, it's for others. That you can give praise to how the Lord brought you up out of the pit. How the Lord brought you out of that miry clay. And he set you on the rock. And now that you're on the rock, he's given you a new song in your mouth. A song of praise to God. And many will see it, and their lives will be changed too. What a beautiful 3 verses. This psalm is just so packed with things. What about it tonight? Will we wait on him? I know things don't always seem to happen when we want them to. But God is working behind the scenes. God is doing his deeds. Working in your heart, working in the hearts of others, working to change you in this process. He's waiting for you to cry out to him. He's interested in your life. He hears your cry, and he wants to pull you out of that pit and that slimy clay and put you on the rock. and He's going to give you a new song. See, our song reflects our heart. Notice it started with a cry, but it ended with a song. What do you have tonight? Do you have a cry? That's great. You need to have a cry before you can have a song. Don't be content in the pit. Don't be content in the slimy clay, but cry out to God. There's too many Christians that are content to be living their life in a pit. There's a lot of Christians that are content to live their life in a slimy clay. They don't want to be on the solid rock. Where are you tonight? I hope that you're on